All right. I think it's 2:01 and we'll just make a start now. So thank you all for joining the Mental Health and AOD webinar. This is our last week, and I'm very excited that Angela Mazur, the Chief OT from Northwestern Mental Health, Midwest Area Mental Health Services, has joined us today. Angela, as I mentioned, is an OT by background, and obviously we had worked together. So Angela, thank you for probably coming in here and doing this webinar. So today, our discussion is around the distraction and calming strategies that we'll be using in the emergency department, and we're quite excited that we believe that this would really be a good tool for our staff members to be able to use in situations when patients need that kind of a care. So I might just do the screen share, Angela, if that's okay. And then I might just ask you to maybe make a start, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Yep, go ahead, Angela.
So thanks, Dev, for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me today to speak to you on this topic, which I'm quite passionate about, sensory modulation. So sensory modulation is the idea that we all have sensory processing, and we all have this, I guess, spectrum of where we sit in terms of processing different sensory systems. So sensory modulation is the regulatory component of sensory processing. And I'll just read out a definition for you. So sensory modulation is the capacity to regulate and organise the degree, intensity and nature of responses to sensory input in a graded and adaptive manner. This allows the individual to achieve and maintain an optimal range of performance and to adapt to challenges in daily life. So just to unpack that a little bit, it's really about us being intentional about the way that we regulate our system so that we are in that optimal range of performing when we need to do tasks during the day. And I'll talk a bit more about that over and under responsivity as we go along. Thanks, Deb. So this idea of optimal arousal is similar to other sort of frameworks, but the idea that we can be hypo-responsive, so have that under-responsivity, or hyper-responsive, over-responsivity. But what we're aiming for is to be in that middle zone, in the green zone, where we're in that sort of quiet, alert state, and that's where we're best able to function and do the tasks that we need to do during the day. Thanks, Deb. So sensory modulation can be looking at either calming or alerting. But for the purposes of this session where we're looking at the ED environment, we're talking more about the calming side of sensory modulation, bringing people down when they're overstimulated or distressed. So while everyone has their own individual way of processing sensory information, and each person has their individual likes and dislikes and preferences around sensory input and sensation, there are some principles that underpin what is experienced as calming and what is experienced as alerting. So the calming are things that are familiar, slow-paced, soothing in terms of music or rhythm, even and rhythmic beats. Things that have positive associations for us, things that are predictable, mild intensity, simple, low demand, and consistent. And the opposite is alerting generally. Thanks, Dev. So I just wanted to look at sensation and perception. Sensation is energy or information detected by specialist receptors of the sensory systems. So those specialist receptors can be our touch receptors, they might be our taste receptors, or our eyes with the rods and cones. And we take in that energy, whether it's light or it's chemicals or it's physical touch, into our receptors. Perception is where that information goes from those receptors into the brain, which then selects, organises and interprets that sensation. So we feel it consciously as a particular sensation. And these two are important because to differentiate between, because where people are under responsive, they may not notice certain things. So even though their specialist sensory receptors are experiencing that sensation, they're not actually perceiving it at the brain level. Thanks, Dev. So I wanted to talk about the sensory systems, and there are 8 senses in the world of sensory modulation as conceptualised by OTs and others. So not just your 5 senses that are commonly talked about, the tactile, vision, hearing, smell and taste, but also interoception, which is your internal awareness of body sensations, proprioception, which is your knowledge of muscles, tendons, ligaments, joint receptors in terms of where your body is in space, and the vestibular system, which is your inner ear, your balance organs. And we'll unpack each one of those as we go along. So we'll look at the next slide, so we can look at each of those 6 different systems. So in terms of vision, I'm going to talk about whether they're sort of external or internal senses. So vision is an external sense. We perceive the sensation that's coming from outside the body. So in this case, light and colour. And we have peripheral vision and focused vision. So the peripheral is more concerned with motion detection. And it's part of our system that alerts us to danger. So we can see things coming from a distance, and our brain decides whether that is something that is friendly or whether that's something to be concerned about and go into our fight, flight kind of mode. The vision system also supports balance, movement, and interaction with objects and environment. So your eye-hand coordination relies on balance. And if you think about when you're standing balancing on one foot, if you close your eyes, it becomes much more challenging to maintain balance. So our vision is definitely part of that system. In terms of what's experienced as calming, so consider colours. Generally, the more muted colours are perceived as calming. Lighting, think about whether there's glare or it's too bright for the person, and if you do have the capacity to change lighting, then to make it a softer lighting for the person. Motion, so there's not too much busy movement around the person, that tends to be alerting, so we're wanting to keep that to a minimum if we're wanting to calm. Simplicity in terms of visual stimulation, so if there's patterns that are too busy or too much colour or too much complexity in a sort of picture, that is not so calming. So we're wanting to go for simplicity and also positive associations for that person. Thanks, Dev, and we'll go on to the next sensory system. So with our auditory system, our hearing, again, it's an external sense, And it's also one that alerts us to danger that can be at a distance as well. It can be a trigger for trauma memories. And so therefore it can be, sometimes people may become triggered and it's hard to know what's actually happened, but it can be an auditory sensation that has triggered that for them. In terms of music, it's almost universally positive for people, but the type of music is very individual. So you'll all know people who listen to music that you hate, and others who don't like the music you like. And so therefore it's really important to personalise music to the individual. And rhythm can influence heart and respiration rates, and calming type of auditory input is familiar, quiet, gentle, rhythmic and melodic. And there are ways to decrease aversive sounds. And I think Dev will perhaps talk a little bit to that in a second. But in terms of thinking about your voice, so use of calm, even tone, and be mindful of the pace of speech so people can follow along and don't start to get confused about what's happening. Dev, did you want to speak to this?
Thanks, Angela. I think just to give people a context, obviously we are in an ED environment where things often are quite busy and it's a fast-paced environment. So I think it is important for us to probably just be aware that obviously some of the patients may be triggered by all of that movement. I think, Angela, you explained beautifully the visual and the auditory sense and how they interact and what helps. And I think it was a very good way to sort of describe some of these principles. If we keep them in mind, maybe there are effective tools that we can use to support our patient group cohort. Thanks.
Thanks, Steph. And we'll go on to the next sensory system. So this system, smell, is also an external sense, and it also alerts us to danger. So things like smoke and gas are really key things that are safety areas, as well as it can be a trauma trigger. So seemingly positive or innocuous smells can be triggering if they're associated for that person with some kind of traumatic event. I had a psychologist tell me recently that one of his clients was triggered suddenly, and they worked out it was actually his cologne that was triggering that person. So it can be really a strong trigger, and there's strong links with emotion. So unlike the other sensory systems, which have a number of kind of checks and balances in terms of how the brain processes them, the sense of smell goes directly to the limbic system. And therefore it should be, any sort of smell should be used with caution. So it's really important to use things that are familiar, individually preferred, and that have positive associations. Thanks, Dev. So this gustatory sense, or the sense of taste, and I also want to mention oral motor. Again, it's externally triggered, so taste of food, drink that we have, chemical senses within our taste buds. It can have strong cultural associations. It can be alerting, so strong and spicy, sour foods. It can also be calming. So often the calming things are the things that are familiar, sweet foods, comfort foods like chocolate and so forth. Favourite beverages and things that have positive associations. In terms of the oral motor sense, which is sucking, blowing, chewing, those kinds of motor functions, sucking is calming. So things like sucking a thick shake through a straw, where you've got to use a strong kind of sucking motion, or sucking a lollipop can be calming. And chewing is organising. So chewing gum, you might often see like cricketers chewing gum, and that's one of the ways they use to remain focused for those you know, when a ball's coming at you at 100 miles an hour, etc. So yes, this oral motor sense can be a helpful one as well in terms of calming. And we'll move on to the next sensory system. Tactile, so our sense of touch can be both external, so the touch on the skin, and internal, so deep pressure touch sense. And there are several types of sensory receptors. So we have receptors for pain, for deep pressure, light touch, and also for temperature and vibration. So again, touch can alert the system to danger or potential threat and trigger fight or flight. So if someone has a trauma history, they can be triggered by often light touch. And we all know the feeling of when you see a spider and then you start to feel like your skin is tickling, and you become alert to the potential for danger. So our sense of touch is really important for body awareness. Clearly our skin covers our whole body, so that sense of our body is crucial in terms of our touch awareness and developing that sense of awareness over time as we grow and develop. It's also important for early attachment experiences. So as they've looked further into young children and babies, they've realised more and more how important and crucial the tactile sense is for those early attachment experiences that set us up for life. In terms of calming, so often warmth, so things like heat packs can be associated with calming. Deep pressure, so things like being wrapped tightly in a blanket, massage, a pet on the lap, or weighted items can be experienced as calming. And there's also some other, techniques that can be helpful, but these are kind of some simple ones that everyone can have access to. Thanks, Dev. So this is one of our internal senses, and proprioception primary receptors are in the muscles, tendons, ligaments, and joint receptors. And they are stimulated by movement against resistance and stretching. So along with the touch system, they contribute to body and spatial awareness. So this is how we know where, we have a sense of our body. It helps us to answer the questions, where am I? What am I doing? And it's also a balancer. So in terms of if someone's over-aroused or under-aroused, it can balance them. It's known as one of the powerhouse sensory systems, along with tactile and vestibular, and can be really powerful in terms of calming. So just some, obviously lots of things can stimulate the proprioceptive system, any sort of movement, stretching, etc. But things like walking, wall push-ups, squats, jogging on the spot can all be helpful. And, if you notice someone agitated, using those sorts of things can be helpful. Next slide, thanks. So the vestibular system is located in our inner ear, and this is another internal sense. It detects gravity, so whether we're upright or not, motion, so whether even when we're in a car or a train, we can still detect whether we're moving or not, and movement of our own body. It has close links with vision and auditory, and is also associated with emotional regulation. if you think about when people become dizzy, they can become quite anxious or agitated. So vestibular is very easy to overstimulate, and generally calming types of vestibular input are slow and linear movements. So rocking back and forth can be quite calming for people without overstimulating the vestibular system. And you might see people doing that sometimes as a way of soothing themselves, particularly people with autism or children and so forth. Dev, did you want to add in there?
Yeah, thanks, Angela. Yeah, I think it is quite good that you've given some of those examples. I think I'm sure people, particularly people on this call who have worked in emergency department, may have seen some of those behaviors, and I think it's good for probably people to be aware of some of these behaviors and why clients may engage in them. And also, I think this gives a good grounding for people to think, when they can probably use some of the interventions that we'll be talking about later in this presentation.
Thanks, Dev. So we'll move on to the next sensory system, which is our final one, the eighth sense, and it's interoception. So those internal body sensations, which are listed there. So hunger or thirst, pain, body temperature, heart rate, things like nausea, sleepiness, tickle, physical exertion, and the need to go to the toilet are all part of the interoceptive system or interoceptive sensations. Thanks, Deb. So the interoceptive system allows us to experience both body states, but also emotional states. So with the body states, we might be prompted to action in order to restore homeostasis. So if we're hungry, we eat. If we're thirsty, we have a drink. And we bring ourselves back into that optimal kind of arousal state. Whereas emotional states are also experienced through bodily sensations. So things like anger, embarrassment, happiness, fear, anxiety, excitement, sadness, they're all experienced by us through the way our body feels, along with our thoughts, and that's how we recognise emotion. So in terms of sensory modulation, there's this idea of neurological threshold, and that's that our bodies are wired in a particular way to experience sensations. For some of us, we have a small cup, which means if we think about sensation as a jug of water, if we're pouring that jug into a small cup, it's going to fill up very quickly, and we will notice that sensation and maybe even overflow and get overwhelmed. Whereas if we have a large cup and are under responsive, it will take a long time to fill up that cup, and we may not notice it until it's quite full. So in other words, we need strong sensory input. And this can be different for each of the sensory systems. So whether it's auditory or whether it's vestibular, we can have a different cup size for each of those, so a different sensitivity level to each of those. So you'll notice that some people don't notice the dripping tap, and others, it drives them crazy. So that's sort of an example of auditory sensitivity versus under responsivity. And we all are on that spectrum somewhere, but there are certain, I guess, conditions that can make people more sensitive to these things, such as autism spectrum disorder, some of the mental health diagnoses. People tend to have a particular profile in terms of their sensory processing.
And I think also, Angela, one of the things that I wanted to add here was trauma often plays a big part in how people react to different senses. And often a lot of clients that we see who may have come to our emergency departments with mental health care needs often have a trauma history or a trauma background, and that often leads them to react in certain ways. And I guess what we, our experience, I'm on OT as well, just for people who may not know that by background. So I think for us, OTs, the experience of using sensory modulation in various environments has really been beneficial and quite fruitful in engaging our patients and making sure that they have something that they can rely on when they're not feeling the best.
Yes, absolutely. Trauma can actually change your profile in terms of how you experience certain sensory systems. So in terms of the use in mental health settings, at present, it's used a lot in inpatient and bed-based settings, and there's often a sensory room which will be set up with various items to support the different sensory and stimulate the different sensory systems, and with the thought of either calming or alerting depending on where the person's functioning at that time. There's also things like kits and trolleys, and the Safe Wards has a calm down box. So all of these things can be supportive of calming and de-escalation and preventing behaviours of concern. There's also support to generalise that to the home environment and assist the person to use the resources they have available at home to support their sensory regulation and modulation. Thanks, Deb.
So, I think that's a great summary of some of the uses that patients, experience in some mental health inpatient units. And I guess the idea that we would have hopefully soon dedicated mental health accommodations within Sunshine Hospital Emergency Department, and also the other services that we are developing at the Footscray Hospital obviously led to this discussion of probably looking at using some of the calming and distraction strategies in our emergency departments to probably provide patients and staff an alternative to some of the regular interventions that we are doing, and this kind of interventions have been used in other emergency departments with various level of success. So I guess for us, these strategies would support patients and ED during their stay. Some of the items and equipment that we've collected and we've made accessible in a bundle or a pastime pack, and staff across our bigger sites at Sunshine and Footscray should be able to access the pastime pack as of Monday. There is in stock. They are available in your respective emergency department storage rooms, as I said, from Monday. The inventory would be managed by the equipment nursing team across at each site. So please let the teams know if you find there are any issues with the stock. These items and equipment, our aim is to have them stored at Sunshine in the hub and the BAU areas, but also in the ED storeroom and the ED storeroom at the Footscray Hospital as well. This also sort of, I guess, is based on the Safe Wards principle that's being rolled out across Western Health, where we can assist patients to draw on their strengths, to learn and use their own coping strategies so that they can self-soothe themselves when they're feeling tense or agitated, and that they can regain motivation when they're feeling bored or not feeling the best. So I guess the idea for us is that for staff who are working on the front line, when they're checking in or when you're checking in on a patient and picking up that they are tense, annoyed, aggrieved, or showing other known indicators that they're becoming angry or agitated, you can offer these calm down strategies, the pastime packs, before considering PRN medication. Please consider the patient's basic comfort and needs. Often that, as Angela just mentioned, that some of those senses are soothed by some of those needs, like, a hot meal, a beverage, if they're allowed to have that. Again, it's all within the clinical and medical parameters. Often people, benefit from these sort of things. As I said, addressing their hunger, addressing their comfort, even addressing their hygiene can have a great impact on how they may or may not behave in a emergency environment. The pastime packs that we have collected includes the mindfulness coloring page, some word searches, some hidden object activities, some crayons, stress balls, and earplugs for them to use. However, we have also got some other amenities outside of the pack, meals and snacks being one. We are looking at some patient entertainment systems. So we've got, if people have had a preliminary look at the hub in Sunshine, there is television in the bedrooms. There is variable lighting that's available through the ED hub and the BAU areas. There is some variable lighting in the X-ray rooms as well that people may or may not have seen. There would be training and orientation provided in how to use those lighting as we open those accommodations, but I guess we just wanted to flag that that is available. We're also looking at providing some headphones and as I said, patient entertainment devices, which can be handy. We're looking through some of those solutions and we'll be making that available soon as well. This is all obviously based on, I guess, the trauma-informed care modules that generally people may or may not have experienced that are there. There's obviously the safe wards principle and the recovery approach that people recover when we provide them with coping mechanisms, and sensory modulation is obviously known to be a very good coping mechanism, particularly as Angela mentioned, for people who might be experiencing sensory processing disorders like autism or ADHD or trauma-related incidents, or even if their senses are not the best, which is, a lot of people with depression, anxiety, and people who present with psychosis or substance use issues often present with those kind of, issues. This is just a bibliography of some of the additional information that you want to find it. However, what we have done is that we have created a policy and procedure document, a QRG, for people to be able to use the sensory equipments that are there. Now, those documents are now available on the ED microsite, and I believe that those documents have also been distributed through staff rooms across the 3 emergency departments. So if you haven't grabbed a copy, please feel free to do so, and please let us know, the ED leadership team at Sunshine, your mental health educator, Pallavi or Victoria, how is your mental health navigator, know if you've got any questions. Now, this is something that obviously we are presenting today, but the idea is that we would be having reflective practice sessions around this as well, so that people do have that opportunity to probably ask questions of our experts that we have currently with us. And yeah, we hope that this is rolled out and people really benefit from it. We are happy to take any questions if anyone has some. Please put it in the chat function. I'm happy. I'm just waiting to see if there are any questions. Okay. It appears that at this stage, I have not seen any questions. Angela, I think that was quite a good presentation. And oh, yeah, Jess, you've got some question. So I'll just wait for the question to be typed in. So thanks for asking that question. The question I will just read out for the audience is sucking, whether or not we can add some lollipops or some sugar-based ingredients to the box. We definitely have looked at some of these options, and it probably is something that you can do on a case-by-case basis. We probably cannot add a lollipop to a pastime pack because it's a pack, but there is nothing to say that you can't try some of this. I don't know, Angela, what do you think?
Yeah, if that person is, doesn't have any contraindications for that kind of thing, then definitely there's no reason why you couldn't try something like a lollipop to help them calm and settle down.
Yeah. And again, if the patient, is wanting, some patients do have some of these things on them as well. So if that is a discussion that happens with the patient, you might actually find that if they find that benefit, they might actually be carrying it with them as well. So if that's the case, yeah, as I said, as long as it's clinically and medically okay to do that, there's no harm in trialing those sort of things. Thanks, Jess, for that question. Any other questions from anyone else? All right. So this concludes the webinar sessions that we were running for this week. So I would like to thank Angela and all the other subject matter experts who actually came in and shared their knowledge and wisdom with our team. And I believe that this information, which would be available on the microsite for people to look afterwards as well, would be useful in improving the care that we provide to our patients. And hopefully this has been a very, I guess, enriching experience for our staff. So yeah, please reach out if you've got any questions or anything that you would like to know to your ED leadership team, myself, or the other staff members who are there. And thank you all for attending today.